When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, not from fear of being caught, but from the dread of what he was about to read. Those messages. The ones I forgot to delete. I lunged to grab the phone from his hand, but he pulled it away effortlessly, eyes fixed on the screen. I watched his face change with every sentence he read, each word slicing through the illusion of our quiet, steady life. Yes, he was about to find out the truth. But not the whole truth. His hands trembled slightly as he continued scrolling, and I knew he was approaching the message. The one that would shatter everything. Or worse, twist it into something unrecognizable. Then, the phone buzzed in his hand. A new notification lit up the screen. I saw his face drain of color as he read the sender's name. He froze. Didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, a habit from when I was younger, something I did to keep from crying. My nerves tangled with dread. His breathing grew faster. I could hear it from across the room. This was the moment I had feared more than anything. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. One I can't take back. One that changed everything. And now, I had no idea what to do. But let me tell you how it all happened. Before I share the secret I've hidden so carefully for so long, leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever had a secret you tried to bury, only to watch it rise back to the surface? I've always thought of pain as something you either manage or ignore. You grit your teeth. You push through. You tell yourself it's age or posture or stress. That's what I did for weeks, until even getting out of bed became a process of negotiation. My lower back stiffened each morning like I was held hostage in my own body. And yet, the idea of making a fuss felt embarrassing. My husband brushed it off, stretch more, he'd say, or try sleeping differently. As if I hadn't already done both. He meant well. But there's a difference between kindness and presence. Between hearing someone and listening to them. It wasn't the pain that pushed me to call him. It was the silence. The kind that creeps in between two people who've stopped asking how the other is really doing. That silence filled our kitchen, our car rides, our evenings on the couch with separate screens lighting our faces. I started scrolling through old contacts one afternoon, more out of boredom than desperation. His name came up. I hadn't seen or spoken to him in years. He had been in my life once, in a way that never fully settled, never fully made sense. My former stepfather, though that word doesn't quite fit. He was my mother's last marriage, quiet and uneventful, dissolving quietly after her passing. He had studied bodywork. Therapeutic massage. That I remembered clearly. Once, I'd caught him gently massaging my mother's hands at the kitchen table after a long day. No candles, no oils, no music. Just intention. The memory came back sharply, almost without invitation. I stared at the number for hours before texting. Just a short message, hi. I heard you still do massage work. My back's been acting up. Would you be open to seeing a former family member? His response came less than an hour later. Warm. Neutral. Of course. I've got a small practice out near the lake now. Tuesdays and Fridays are open. The drive out there was long enough to make me rethink everything. By the time I reached the narrow gravel path leading to his studio, my palms were damp. The place looked like a part of him, quiet, structured, surrounded by pine trees and slow-moving wind. He greeted me at the door with a nod and a faint smile. We didn't hug. We weren't those people. But something passed between us. Recognition. Not nostalgia, something more like mutual quiet. The inside of the studio was simple. Clean. No frills. Wooden floor, a massage table, shelves of books, a kettle in the corner. It felt more like a study than a spa. He motioned for me to sit, asked a few questions about the pain, my routine, what seemed to trigger it. His voice was calm, deliberate. I realized I hadn't heard it in nearly a decade. When I laid down on the table, fully clothed at his request, there was a moment when I wanted to laugh. This was ridiculous. I could have gone to a clinic downtown. But I didn't. I chose this. His hands were careful. Methodical. Nothing inappropriate. But not impersonal either. They found the spots I didn't know were aching. His thumbs traced along the muscles with practiced pressure, and slowly, breath by breath, I felt my body soften. Not just the pain, something else. Something I hadn't named in a long time. The session lasted 45 minutes. When it ended, he offered me tea. Chamomile. No small talk. Just quiet. We sat across from each other, steam rising between us. I didn't know what to say, so I focused on my hands. My nails. A small chip of polish. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of things we weren't ready to say. When I left, I felt lighter. Not fixed. But changed, somehow. At home, my husband was in the garage. Didn't ask where I'd been. I didn't offer. That night, as I lay in bed, I reached for my lower back. The pain had lessened. Not gone, but less urgent. Like something had finally been heard. And yet, I couldn't sleep. My mind wandered, not to the hands, but to the way he watched me leave. With a stillness that unsettled something in me. Was this just therapy? Or had I opened a door I didn't know still existed? That night, I dreamt of pine trees. Of hands resting gently on a spine. Of silence, deep and steady like breath held in a chest. The second appointment came quicker than I expected. I had told myself I'd wait a week, maybe two, to let the novelty of the experience settle into something less complicated. But when the discomfort in my back returned, sharp and familiar, I found myself texting him that same evening. He replied with a slot the next morning. I didn't even hesitate before confirming. This time, I didn't fumble with directions or second-guess the drive. The road through the trees felt almost comforting. Like the stretch of forest recognized me, welcomed me back. I wore something looser, stretch fabric, a soft sweater, and applied a touch of lip balm, though I told myself it was for the wind. The sun filtered gently through the branches, and the quietness in my car mirrored the quietness inside me. Still, as I pulled into the same gravel lot and stepped out, a flicker of anxiety returned. It wasn't fear. It was awareness. Awareness of myself, of my choices, of him. He opened the door before I knocked, as if he'd been standing nearby. We exchanged a brief greeting, and again, there was no hug. Just the air shifting between us. I took off my coat, folded it carefully, and laid it over the same chair as last time. He had already set up the room, same soft lighting, same crisp linens, same faint smell of eucalyptus lingering in the air. I lay on the table again, this time without hesitation. He adjusted a bolster under my knees and gently positioned a warm cloth over my back. It was quiet except for the sound of his hands moving across the lotion bottle, the soft creak of wood beneath our steps, the rhythm of his breathing. This session was different. His hands moved with more familiarity, still professional, but something had shifted. The pauses between movements were longer, the transitions smoother. He focused more deeply on the lower lumbar region, the area I hadn't known was storing so much of my tension. His thumbs pressed into places that made me wince, and then sigh. I felt something unraveling, not just in my muscles, but in me. At one point, I opened my eyes to look at the floor beneath the table and caught my own reflection in the polished wood surface. My face looked tired, but alert. There was a strange expression I didn't quite recognize. I wanted to believe it was relief, but it was more than that. After the session, he offered me tea again. We sat at the same table, but this time the silence wasn't so neutral. He asked about my week. I told him about a recipe I had ruined. We laughed, lightly, and I noticed the way the corners of his eyes crinkled. I mentioned that my husband had left town for a few days, something I hadn't planned to say, and regretted the moment the words left my mouth. He didn't react. Just nodded and poured more tea. When I stood to leave, he followed me to the door. I turned to say goodbye and thank him again. And then, it happened. We kissed. No warning. No build-up. No cinematic pause. Just a brief moment that started and ended in a blink. There was no passion in it, at least not in the traditional sense. It wasn't hungry. It wasn't romantic. It was quiet. Muted. But it was real. It caught us both off guard. I stepped back almost instantly. He did too. And for a moment, neither of us knew where to place our eyes. I murmured something like I should go, and he nodded. He didn't try to stop me. I walked back to my car on legs that didn't feel entirely like my own. The drive home was a blur. I didn't play music. I didn't make any calls. I didn't rehearse explanations. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Every red light stretched forever. At home, the house felt colder than I remembered. I took off my shoes too quickly, stubbed my toe on the hallway bench, and cursed under my breath. I didn't go upstairs right away. Instead, I stood in the kitchen and stared at the tile floor. My tea mug from that morning was still in the sink. Lipstick smudged on the rim. I picked it up and washed it slowly, carefully, as if it mattered. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on my side, my back to the empty half of the bed. I watched the digital clock blink its silent numbers, each one pulling me further from rest. I wasn't thinking about the kiss, not exactly. I was thinking about how effortless it had been. How unceremonious. How expected it felt. There was no guilt. Not yet. There was only a strange kind of clarity. A stillness in knowing that something had crossed a line inside me, and there was no walking it back. It wasn't the physical contact that lingered. It was the intention. Or maybe the lack of resistance. The way we both allowed it to happen. No protest. No words. I replayed the moment again and again. Not to romanticize it, but to understand it. Where had it started? In the silence of the room? In the way he had touched my spine? Or days before, when I found his number again? Maybe it started before that. Maybe it started the moment I stopped feeling seen at home. The moment our conversations became schedules. The moment intimacy became a transaction of comfort and routine. I thought about telling someone. But who? A friend? A therapist? My sister, who would probably ask if I was having a midlife crisis. No one could understand it without painting me as reckless. As impulsive. As bored. But I wasn't bored. I was awake. That's what scared me the most. I closed my eyes and saw the studio again. The wood panels. The light through the trees. His hand reaching for the kettle. The quiet. The space between two people who once shared a version of family, and now, something else. I didn't know what this was. But it wasn't nothing. And it wouldn't go away just because I wanted it to. The morning came quietly. I made coffee like usual, fed the cat, checked my calendar. I had emails to send, errands to run. Life demanded normalcy. But underneath it all, a part of me had already shifted. Like tectonic plates. Silent, but irreversible. Something had begun. Something I hadn't expected. Something I couldn't name. But I knew, with quiet certainty, that this was only the beginning. The following days unfolded with unsettling quiet. I kept busy, laundry, emails, groceries, but every action felt like a delay tactic, a distraction to keep myself from acknowledging the change that had taken place. I tried to reduce the kiss to a momentary lapse in judgment, a misstep in an otherwise controlled life. But that explanation never held long. Because it hadn't felt like a mistake in the moment. It had felt inevitable. I didn't reach out to him. I didn't cancel either. The next appointment was already on my calendar. Friday at 11. I hovered over the event on my phone more times than I'd like to admit, debating whether to delete it, move it, ignore it. I did none of those things. I let the days carry me toward it. At night, my thoughts grew louder. I'd stare at the ceiling and think of the sensation of being seen, really seen. Not admired, not complimented, just noticed. Like I was more than my tasks or responsibilities. Like I was someone worth paying attention to. That feeling hadn't visited me in a long time. It had entered the room with that kiss and refused to leave. My husband returned from his work trip midweek. He brought me a scarf from the airport gift shop, beige with blue threading. I thanked him and wrapped it around my shoulders. He seemed satisfied with that. We made dinner together that night, pasta with lemon and garlic, and chatted about his meetings, his hotel, the weather in San Diego. I smiled and nodded, asked questions, performed the choreography of a wife. He didn't ask about my week. I didn't offer. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I stood in front of the mirror for a long time, brushing my hair, watching the small adjustments in my expression as I practiced neutrality. I chose simple clothes again, nothing suggestive, nothing planned. But I took more time than necessary. I noticed the way my blouse fit differently depending on how I stood. I put on perfume. A very small amount. Almost nothing. The drive was harder this time. Not because I didn't know the route, but because the weight of knowing sat beside me like an unwelcome passenger. I wasn't naive. I understood what I was doing, or, rather, what I was allowing to happen. There's a difference between crossing a line and standing near it long enough that the border disappears beneath your feet. His studio looked the same, of course. But my body responded differently. As soon as I parked, I noticed my breath had shortened. I sat in the car longer than usual. My hand hovered over the door handle. I could leave. I could drive back home and tell him I wasn't feeling well. I could disappear. But I didn't. He greeted me with the same quiet presence. Nothing in his posture or tone hinted at what had happened between us. He offered tea, which I declined, and motioned toward the massage table. I removed my coat, folded it carefully again, and sat at the edge of the table while he adjusted the bolster. As I lay down, I noticed the silence differently this time. It wasn't awkward or empty. It was full of possibilities. His hands resumed their familiar rhythm, calm, assured, respectful. And yet, everything felt different. Every touch, though identical in technique, carried the memory of that kiss. My skin responded more sensitively. I noticed the pattern of his breathing, the slight shift in temperature where his hands met my back. He didn't speak. I didn't either. The session passed slowly. Or perhaps I slowed it down in my mind, examining every second for hidden meaning. At one point, I had the strange sensation that I was outside my body, watching myself from the ceiling. I didn't recognize the woman on the table. She looked peaceful. Still. Not like someone unraveling. But that's what I was doing, unraveling, thread by thread, beneath practiced hands and a neutral expression. When the session ended, I sat up slowly. My limbs felt heavy, as if I had just woken from a dream. He offered me water. I took it this time. Our eyes met briefly as I sipped. Neither of us smiled. "I'll see you next week?" I asked. He nodded. "Same time?" I said yes. We walked toward the door in silence. This time, he opened it but didn't step aside. For a moment, we stood close, too close. But neither of us moved. I turned to leave, feeling his presence behind me like a hand between my shoulder blades. The moment I stepped into the daylight, the spell broke. The air was colder than I remembered. I walked to my car quickly, started the engine, and kept my hands tight on the steering wheel the entire drive home. Inside the house, my husband was in the kitchen, reading something on his tablet. He looked up and asked, "How was your appointment?" The question was casual. Automatic. "It helped," I replied, keeping my voice even. He nodded and went back to his screen. I stood in the doorway for a few seconds longer than I needed to, then walked past him into the living room. I sat on the edge of the couch, folded my hands, and looked around our home. Everything was in its place, the books on the shelf, the framed photographs, the worn throw blanket on the armchair. It should have felt like comfort. Instead, it felt like set dressing. That evening, I made dinner again. Roasted chicken with herbs. I overcooked the carrots. My husband didn't notice. After we ate, he cleared the dishes, and I wiped down the counters. We moved like dancers rehearsing a familiar sequence, each step memorized, each glance expected. Later, in bed, I lay awake listening to the sound of his breathing. I counted each inhale, then each exhale. I wondered if he could tell that something had shifted. But if he did, he didn't say. The next morning, he left early for a client meeting. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, staring at the calendar. My next appointment was 5 days away. The number blinked at me, quiet and certain. I didn't feel excitement. I didn't feel dread. I felt anticipation. Like something unresolved was waiting for me, just beyond the horizon of routine. And in that space between silence and motion, I realized something. This wasn't just about my back anymore. It hadn't been for a while. There was a stiffness in the air the morning of my 4th visit. Not the kind that comes with weather, but the kind that settles in your chest before you make a decision you can't reverse. I sat on the edge of the bed longer than usual, my feet not quite touching the floor, robe wrapped tightly around me. The house was still. My husband had already left. The cat sat in the hallway, watching me as if it knew I wasn't being honest with anyone, including myself. I didn't want to admit that I had been planning what to wear since yesterday. A soft navy sweater that dipped slightly in the back, paired with jeans that clung in all the right places but looked casual enough to say this is just comfort. I told myself it was about confidence. About feeling better in my body. I didn't say aloud what else it might be about. The drive was quiet, but internally I was a mess of shifting thoughts. I kept revisiting every glance, every moment of stillness that had passed between us the last time. How we stood at the door, not speaking, not touching. That absence spoke louder than 1,000 conversations. And I didn't know what this session would bring. Would he address it? Would I? Or would we slip into a version of silence where everything was implied and nothing acknowledged? I wasn't sure which outcome I feared more. As I pulled into the gravel drive, the sight of the studio brought with it a wave of something that wasn't quite dread. Anticipation, maybe. Like standing at the edge of a lake, fully clothed, unsure if I should wade in or stay dry on the shore. The building stood unchanged, but I wasn't the same woman who first stepped through its doors. He greeted me as usual, his voice calm, his expression unreadable. I took my coat off and folded it carefully again, each movement feeling rehearsed. I noticed small details I hadn't before, a new plant on the windowsill, the way his shoes were aligned near the door. It felt too intimate to notice such things, and yet I couldn't stop. The session began in silence. I lay down and closed my eyes. His hands moved with the same practiced confidence, but my body was far more reactive now. I noticed every shift in pressure, every pause. At times, I forgot to breathe. My thoughts looped, circling through every moment that had led us here. I kept wondering, was this the point of no return? Or had I already passed it? He didn't touch me differently. Nothing was inappropriate. But everything felt magnified. My shoulder blade, my hip, the base of my neck, each place he pressed into seemed to unlock more than muscle tension. I remembered moments I hadn't thought about in years. The scent of my mother's scarf. The sound of rain against the windows in that same house. The way he had once helped me carry a box down the stairs, our fingers brushing briefly. When the session ended, I sat up slowly, wrapping the soft blanket around my shoulders. I didn't reach for my water right away. He stood nearby, giving me space, but the silence this time was charged. I looked at him, expecting to find an answer in his expression, but he didn't offer one. Instead, he asked if I was feeling better. Yes, I replied, my voice softer than I intended. Physically, yes. He nodded. I could tell he wanted to say more. Or maybe I just wanted him to. But neither of us did. We walked toward the door again, the same slow steps, the same unbearable nearness. This time, he stepped aside more quickly, opened the door wider, like he didn't want to be tempted by whatever had lingered the last time. Outside, the air had changed. Clouds had rolled in. It wasn't cold, but the sky looked heavier than it had earlier that morning. I stood next to my car for a moment before unlocking it, unsure what I was waiting for. Closure? Permission? A reason? None came. Back at home, the house welcomed me with the kind of silence that had once felt safe. Now it just felt empty. My husband texted to say he'd be home late, client dinner. I typed out a quick reply and hit send without reading it back. I made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. I stared at the blank screen, then clicked through old photos instead. Ones from a vacation 3 summers ago. My husband and I on a beach, smiling. Everything about those pictures felt curated. The poses. The filtered light. The way we stood too far apart, arms not quite touching. I remembered the trip, but not the warmth. Later, while folding laundry, I came across a dress I hadn't worn in over a year. It was simple, dark green, elegant without effort. I held it up against myself, studying my reflection in the hallway mirror. I didn't look like a different woman. But I felt like one. There was something in my eyes now, a kind of alertness. A quiet refusal to go back to sleep. I hung the dress on the back of the bedroom door, not knowing why. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about something he had said during one of our first sessions: the body stores what the mind forgets. I hadn't paid much attention to it then. But now it felt like a thread I couldn't stop pulling. What had my body been holding all these years? What quiet disappointments, what buried needs, what silenced desires? I wasn't angry at my husband. That's what made it harder. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't absent. He was present in the way people are when they think presence is enough. We shared meals. We shared routines. But we didn't share ourselves anymore. Not really. We hadn't for a long time. I kept asking myself the same question, night after night: Was I being disloyal? Or was I just waking up to a version of myself I had ignored? There wasn't an answer. Not yet. But the questions grew louder. And the silence in our home more hollow. The next morning, I opened my calendar and saw it there, Friday at 11. Same time next week. I didn't delete it. By the time the 5th appointment approached, I had stopped pretending it was about my back. The pain had become manageable weeks ago, softer, more like a whisper than a cry. I still felt it in the mornings, but it no longer dictated my movements. And yet, I kept the sessions on my calendar, arriving each Friday with more composure and less excuse. The ritual was no longer about healing. It was about presence, his, mine, and whatever existed in the space between. I woke up early that morning. Too early. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the sky outside the window held the first signs of light. I lay in bed and listened to the sounds of the house's pipes groaning, the faint whir of the fridge downstairs, the occasional creak of settling wood. My husband stirred beside me, murmured something incoherent, then rolled over. I watched his back for a long time. It was familiar. Solid. Predictable. We hadn't spoken about anything meaningful in days. Our conversations had reduced to logistics, dinner, errands, reminders. I noticed the way he avoided lingering glances. The way his hand no longer brushed mine when we passed each other in the hallway. Perhaps it was unconscious. Perhaps it was survival. Either way, I didn't reach for him. After breakfast, I spent longer than necessary getting ready. I wasn't dressing to impress, but I was intentional. A soft blouse with rolled sleeves, comfortable trousers, small earrings. Nothing loud. Nothing that demanded attention. But still, a quiet kind of care. I applied mascara slowly, the same way I had in college, when I still believed it made me look more awake. Some habits never leave. The drive felt shorter than usual. The landscape blurred into a soft palette of green and gray. I didn't turn on the radio. I needed silence, not the kind that fills space, but the kind that allows thought to breathe. His studio stood unchanged, though I noticed the leaves around the path had begun to turn. Early autumn always carried a certain melancholy. A quiet fading. A slow undoing of warmth. I parked, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car with less hesitation than before. He opened the door the moment I reached it, as if he had been waiting. We exchanged a brief nod, no greeting, no smile. Just understanding. I stepped inside, removed my coat, and placed it on the same chair. The routine was so practiced now that it barely felt like something I was doing. It felt like something I was becoming. The session started in silence, as always. I lay down on the table, adjusted the headrest, closed my eyes. His hands began their usual pattern, moving with quiet authority. Every motion deliberate, every pause considered. But something felt different today, quieter, but more intense. Like the air between us had thickened. Every touch carried weight. Not inappropriate. Not invasive. Just present. Entirely present. I didn't think about what would happen after. I didn't think about consequences or lines or definitions. I existed only in that moment, in the slow motion of his hands tracing the outline of pain I no longer named. My breathing changed. My thoughts slowed. Time became irrelevant. Near the end of the session, as he adjusted the position of my arm, our eyes met. Not briefly. Not accidentally. Fully. Intentionally. I felt something shift, subtle but irreversible. After I sat up, wrapped in a soft blanket, he handed me a glass of water. I held it, but didn't drink. My fingers tightened around the cup as I looked at him, searching for something I couldn't articulate. And then, it happened again. We kissed. No words. No warning. Just the same quiet inevitability as before. Our lips met, held, and parted, no longer unsure, no longer accidental. It was not an escalation. It was an echo. A confirmation. An acknowledgement of the current that had been building between us all along. We stepped back at the same time. No one spoke. He returned to the kettle, poured more tea into a second cup. I sat at the small table, still holding the water, unsure what to do with it now. Minutes passed like hours. Eventually, I stood. Collected my coat. Adjusted my collar. We didn't make eye contact again. Not because we couldn't, but because we didn't need to. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves skittered across the ground, dry and restless. I stood beside my car longer than necessary, pretending to search for my keys. But really, I was just catching my breath. Not from exertion, but from the reality of what had happened. Again. The drive home was slower this time. I obeyed every speed limit, stopped fully at every sign, let others pass when they needed to. I felt like I was returning from something I hadn't told the truth about. Like I had smuggled an invisible weight across a border no one else could see. At home, the house was empty. My husband had left a note on the fridge reminding me about dinner with friends that evening. I stared at it, then folded it into my pocket. The handwriting felt too neat. Too rehearsed. I wasn't angry. Just tired. I went upstairs, changed into loungewear, and sat by the bedroom window for over an hour. Watching the street. The trees. The world continuing as if nothing had shifted. But everything had. I didn't know what this meant. I didn't know what I would do next. But I knew that normal had cracked. That something had entered my life quietly, without demand or declaration, and begun rewriting the script I'd followed for decades. I still loved my husband. In the way you love familiarity. In the way you love silence that doesn't ask too much. But I was beginning to suspect that love wasn't the same as fullness. That love didn't always make room for truth. And truth, in its quietest form, had just whispered something I could no longer ignore. The days after the fifth session moved with a strange rhythm. I went through motions that had once felt effortless, grocery lists, laundry, returning client emails, but now they carried a heaviness I couldn't name. It wasn't guilt exactly. It wasn't regret either. It was more like an awareness that wouldn't leave me alone, a kind of internal hum that followed me into every room, every thought. I avoided mirrors. Not because I feared what I'd see, but because I didn't want to watch myself pretending. Pretending that everything at home was as it had always been. Pretending that my husband's stories about work still held my attention. Pretending that I could hold his gaze without remembering another's hands, another's eyes. That weekend, we went to dinner with friends. A small gathering at a couple's house just outside the city, people we'd known for years. The kind of evening with recycled jokes and wine that tasted more expensive than it actually was. I wore the green dress I had pulled from the back of the closet, and I watched my husband notice it, though he didn't say anything. His fingers rested lightly on my lower back as we entered the house. I didn't flinch, but I also didn't lean in. Conversations swirled around the table, someone's daughter getting married, someone else's renovation woes, health updates masked as humor. I smiled and nodded, chimed in when expected, but I wasn't really there. My body was present. My voice played its part. But my mind kept drifting back to that moment in the studio. The weight of stillness after we kissed. The unspoken understanding that neither of us had reached for, yet both had embraced. Back home that night, after we undressed and got into bed, my husband reached for me. Not forcefully. Not urgently. Just his hand on my waist, the beginning of something familiar. I turned toward him, kissed his shoulder, and whispered that I was tired. He didn't push. Just rolled over, and soon his breathing slowed into sleep. I stared at the ceiling, wondering if he could feel the distance between us. Or if it had always been there and I was only now admitting it. The next few days passed with a kind of mechanical precision. I filled the hours with productivity. Cleaned out the guest room closet. Reorganized the spice rack. Paid bills early. I answered texts quickly, enthusiastically, overcompensating for the quiet behind my screen. I walked more. Cooked more. Smiled more. But nothing filled the space that had opened up inside me. Wednesday morning, my husband casually mentioned a weekend away. Friends of his had offered their lake house for a couple of days. They're out of town, and it's just sitting empty, he said while pouring coffee. I nodded. I didn't ask questions. I knew this was his attempt to reconnect, to rekindle something. Or maybe just to feel like we were trying. He told me to pack for 3 nights. I did so methodically, jeans, sweaters, books I wouldn't read. I didn't know if I was looking forward to it. I only knew I wasn't dreading it. On the drive to the lake house, I watched the trees blur past the window. Early autumn had deepened. The leaves had turned, some already beginning to fall. My husband hummed along to the radio, occasionally tapping the steering wheel. At one point, he asked if I was okay. Yes, I answered, because I don't know felt too heavy for the car. The house was beautiful, in that curated way second homes often are. Neutral tones, plush furniture, an almost sterile kind of luxury. We unpacked in silence, each claiming our corners. He went to check the thermostat. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared out at the lake. The water was still, reflective, holding the sky like a secret. That night, we opened a bottle of wine and sat by the fireplace. He told stories from work. I nodded, laughed where I was supposed to. He complimented my cooking, my patience, my strength. Words that felt like appreciation but not intimacy. I smiled through them, then changed the subject. In the early hours of the next morning, I slipped out of bed and walked down to the dock. The air was cold, but not biting. I pulled the sleeves of my sweater over my hands and sat at the edge, letting my feet dangle just above the water. The silence of nature always had a different texture, full, rather than empty. I inhaled deeply and closed my eyes. And then, almost without thinking, I picked up my phone and sent a message. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just a question, are you around today? He didn't answer right away. I didn't expect him to. I returned to the house, made coffee, and sat in the reading nook with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. My husband remained upstairs. The morning passed slowly, the kind of slow that makes you examine every second for hidden meaning. When my phone finally buzzed, I felt it before I saw it. The response was brief, yes. You okay? I typed and deleted 3 different replies before settling on, can we talk? The message was read. No dots appeared for a while. Then, finally, here if you need. I told my husband I was going into town to pick up a few things. He didn't question it. Just asked if I could grab more coffee beans. I nodded, kissed his temple, and grabbed my keys. The drive from the lake house to the studio took just over 20 minutes. I knew the roads by now. I knew where the turns tightened and where the trees opened to reveal sky. I pulled into the gravel lot and sat in the car with the engine off, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal. Then I stepped out and walked to the door. This time, he didn't greet me at the entrance. I knocked softly. When he opened the door, there was a pause. A breath. A decision. And then I stepped inside. We didn't talk right away. We didn't need to. The silence said everything. What happened after wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. There were no confessions, no declarations. We spent the night together. The morning after didn't begin with regret. It began with stillness. A kind I hadn't experienced in years, not the kind that settles over a quiet house or an empty room, but the kind that seeps into your skin when there are no more immediate decisions to make. The weight of what happened the night before hadn't yet turned into guilt. It hadn't morphed into shame or excuses. It was just present. Like an echo you're still listening to long after the sound has faded. I opened my eyes slowly. Light filtered through the window in muted streaks, illuminating the dust in the air. I didn't move at first. My limbs felt heavy, but not exhausted. Just grounded. Anchored. I looked at the ceiling and tried to understand what I was supposed to feel. But nothing fit neatly into any category. This wasn't joy. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't euphoria or despair. It was something in between. Something still forming. Beside me, he was awake. Not looking at me, but awake. I could tell by the rhythm of his breath. It had changed. We didn't speak. We didn't reach for each other. We just lay there, breathing in the same room, suspended between what had happened and what would come next. Eventually, I sat up, pulling the blanket around me. My clothes were nearby, folded over the back of a chair. I gathered them slowly, carefully, like I was afraid to break the moment. He stood a few minutes later, quiet and deliberate, and disappeared into the other room. I didn't follow. I took my time dressing. Each movement felt deliberate, like I was stitching myself back into the version of me that the world recognized. The version that had responsibilities, routines, and a husband waiting at a lake house who didn't know that his wife had stepped over a threshold she couldn't return from. When I stepped into the hallway, he was in the kitchen, pouring tea into 2 mugs. No music played. No small talk filled the space. Just 2 people occupying the same air with an understanding too complex to reduce into conversation. He handed me the mug. Our fingers didn't touch. I sipped in silence, standing by the window, watching the leaves fall outside. It was beautiful. The kind of beauty that felt unfair to witness at such a moment. I wanted to remember it, not as a backdrop to what we did, but as something separate. Something clean. We didn't talk about what had happened. We didn't deconstruct it. There was no need. Words, at that point, would have only diluted the truth. It had happened. It was real. And now it lived between us, whether we acknowledged it or not. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly 10. Too late for a quick stop at a store. Too late to pretend I had only been gone an hour. I texted my husband, told him I had decided to take a walk by the lake after picking up coffee. No explanation for the delay. Just a sentence meant to delay suspicion, if there was any. He replied simply, "Okay. Be safe." When I returned to the lake house, the air felt different. Not because he knew, he didn't. But because I did. I carried the knowledge like a second skin, invisible but palpable. I stepped inside, placed the bag of groceries I'd picked up on the way on the kitchen counter, and joined him on the porch. He looked up from his book, smiled, and motioned to the chair beside him. I sat. The lake shimmered in the afternoon light, still and deceptively peaceful. We talked about nothing for a while. Weather. What to cook for dinner. Whether we should take the canoe out before sunset. He didn't ask about my morning, and I didn't offer more than what I'd already texted. But I watched him more carefully than usual. Studied the lines on his face, the way he held his coffee cup, the way his foot tapped the wooden floor in a slow, unconscious rhythm. It was all so familiar. And yet I felt like I was seeing him from the other side of a glass wall. That evening, we cooked together. He chopped vegetables while I stirred a pot of soup. Our hands moved in sync, our conversation light, even playful. From the outside, we must have looked like a couple deeply connected, seasoned, comfortable, content. And in some ways, we were. But beneath that layer, I was someone else. Someone he didn't know. Someone I hadn't been until now. As we ate, I watched him tell a story about work, his voice animated, eyes bright. I nodded and smiled, offering questions at the right moments. I wasn't faking my interest. I just wasn't fully in the room. Part of me hovered elsewhere, on a wooden floor, in a quiet studio, wrapped in a blanket, drinking tea in silence. After dinner, we sat by the fireplace again. He reached for my hand and laced his fingers through mine. I let him. I didn't pull away. His warmth was familiar, and part of me still longed for it. But it wasn't enough to quiet the noise in my mind. The noise wasn't loud, but it was constant. A low hum of truth, vibrating beneath every touch, every word. We went to bed early. He kissed my forehead, pulled me close, and whispered something soft I didn't quite catch. I nodded and closed my eyes, pretending to fall asleep before him. I listened to his breathing as it slowed, as his body settled into the mattress, unaware of what had shifted beneath the surface. In the darkness, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if this would be the last time I could pretend. Pretend that everything was as it had been. That I was still the woman he married. That we were still enough for each other. But I knew the truth. I had crossed something. Not just a physical line, but an emotional one. I had found a version of myself I couldn't unfind. A need I couldn't unfeel. And now I was left to carry it. Not with shame. Not even with sorrow. But with the quiet, steady weight of knowing. The following week passed like something suspended in amber. Everything looked normal, functioned normally, moved forward as expected, but under the surface, time had thickened. The air felt heavier. The small moments between events, waiting for the kettle to boil, standing in the shower, folding laundry, stretched longer than they should have, filled with thoughts I wasn't prepared to sort through. Back home from the lake house, we slipped effortlessly into routine. My husband returned to work, and I returned to the house. To the rooms where silence waited patiently, as if it had known I would come back different. I didn't speak about the weekend. Neither did he. It wasn't avoidance. It was something quieter than that. As though we had both silently agreed not to look too closely at each other. But I began to notice his gaze lingered longer than before. He watched me across the table when I wasn't looking. Or maybe I had just stopped pretending not to notice. There was a shift, subtle but persistent, in the way he moved through our shared space. His hands were less careless. His tone less distracted. He asked more questions. How did you sleep? What are you reading these days? Do you want to try that new restaurant Friday night? At first, I welcomed it. I told myself it was what I had wanted for so long, to be noticed, engaged, considered. But the attention didn't land the way it once might have. It didn't soothe me. It unsettled me. Because now I understood what real presence felt like. What it was to be held in the gaze of someone who wasn't asking anything from you, just seeing you fully. I had lived that in quiet moments, in a studio where words were rare and silence was full of weight. I didn't reach out to him. Not after that night. I hadn't planned to. There were no follow-up messages. No soft reassurances. We had simply parted with the understanding that nothing could be undone, and nothing would be forced forward. We had left the moment where it belonged, in its own still, breathless corner of time. But my body hadn't forgotten. My thoughts hadn't settled. I carried the memory with the same reverence one might carry something fragile in a crowded room, held close, protected, not spoken about. One morning, a week later, I found myself sitting in the kitchen longer than usual. The house was quiet. My coffee had gone cold. I hadn't moved in 20 minutes. The clock ticked gently on the wall, indifferent to my stillness. And in that quiet, something shifted again. Not a decision. Just a recognition. I couldn't live in between. Not indefinitely. Not honestly. That afternoon, I opened my laptop and stared at the calendar. I hadn't canceled my next massage appointment. It still sat there, Friday at 11. I hovered over it. Not with the intention of deleting it. Not with the plan to confirm it. Just to acknowledge that it existed. That I had kept that door slightly ajar, even if I wasn't ready to walk through it again. And then I closed the laptop without taking action. The next day, I found my husband standing in the doorway of my office, holding 2 mugs of tea. He offered me one. I took it. We sat on the small couch in silence for a while before he spoke. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. "We've both changed." I looked at him. His face was calm. Not suspicious. Not accusatory. Just observant. He continued, "Maybe it's time we talked about what we want next. I don't mean right now. Just soon." I nodded. That was all. I didn't offer a speech. I didn't ask him what prompted it. Because deep down, I knew. He didn't know anything concrete. But he knew enough. He felt it. The distance. The way I occupied the room differently now. The way I smiled with my lips but not my eyes. That evening, I walked through the house slowly, room by room. I touched the bookshelf in the living room, ran my hand along the hallway banister, opened the linen closet just to fold a towel that was already neat. Everything looked exactly as it had for years. But none of it felt untouched. My fingerprints were everywhere now. Not just in dust or fabric, but in decisions. In absences. In changes I could no longer disguise. Friday came, and I didn't go to the studio. Instead, I drove to the park near the library, where the old trees curved over the benches like guardians. I sat there for an hour, watching people pass, dog walkers, parents with strollers, teenagers with too loud headphones. Life, unbothered by the intricacies of mine. I didn't cry. I didn't write. I didn't scroll through my phone. I just sat. Let the weight settle in its own time. Let the space around me expand to fit everything I hadn't said. When I returned home, there was a note on the counter from my husband. He'd gone to the hardware store. Leftovers in the fridge. No mention of dinner plans or appointments or questions. Just logistics. And somehow, that small detail, the normalcy of it, made me ache more than anything else. That night, I lay awake long after he fell asleep. I watched the moon shift across the bedroom wall. I thought about all the choices we make that don't look like choices. The silences we let grow. The truths we never speak aloud. The messages we don't send, the words we swallow, the doors we close so gently they don't make a sound. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, I whispered to no one in particular, "This is not the end." But something has ended. I didn't know what would come next. But I knew it would ask more of me than comfort. It would ask for truth. The following days unfolded with a kind of quiet tension, like the hush before a storm that might never come. It wasn't that something dramatic had changed, but that everything subtle had. My husband and I moved through the house as though we were sharing a space without truly being in it together. He didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer answers. It was a mutual agreement wrapped in politeness and self-preservation. He still cooked on Tuesdays. Still kissed my forehead before heading to work. Still left folded laundry on my side of the bed. But the warmth that used to be woven through those actions had cooled. Not frozen, just cooled. Like leftovers warmed a little too late. Familiar, but no longer nourishing. I began waking earlier than usual, before the alarm, when the sky was still a slate of gray outside the bedroom window. I'd sit on the edge of the bed, wrapped in the throw blanket from the footboard, listening to the slow, rhythmic breathing of the man beside me. In those moments, he seemed so far away, not physically, but in some way that couldn't be bridged by a kiss or a conversation. It was as if we had drifted onto two separate boats, still waving at each other from a polite distance, unsure whether to row back or simply watch the space grow. I stopped going to the studio. Not by any spoken decision, not with any dramatic closure. I simply didn't schedule another appointment. I deleted the calendar entry and closed the page without fanfare. It was a choice made in silence, the same kind of silence that had defined so many of our recent days. But I didn't feel finished. I just felt paused. One afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in our hallway. The one that sat above the narrow table where we kept keys, mail, a small ceramic bowl for loose change. I looked at my reflection and studied the slight lines at the corners of my eyes, the tension around my mouth. I didn't look like someone who had done something reckless. I didn't look like someone falling apart. But there was something in my expression I didn't recognize, something that looked like distance from my own life. Later that evening, while putting away clean dishes, I opened the top drawer and found a folded note resting atop the silverware. It was handwritten, in my husband's familiar script. 5 words, written simply. I know. We are different. I held the note in my hands for a long time. My fingers curled around it gently, as if it might vanish. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel a rush of emotion. Just a settling. A small shift inward. The way a room changes after someone opens a window, even if no one says a word. I left the note in my coat pocket and didn't mention it to him. He didn't bring it up either. But something changed in the way he looked at me after that. Not with suspicion. Not with resentment. With recognition. It was a Wednesday when I finally allowed myself to revisit the message thread I had left dormant on my phone. No new texts. No unread messages. Just the last few lines of a conversation that had ended on its own terms. I stared at the screen for several minutes before locking it again and placing the phone face down on the table. I had nothing to say. Not yet. But I had questions. Ones I hadn't allowed myself to explore. What do you owe a life that kept you safe but made you invisible? What do you owe a person who never meant to hurt you but stopped reaching for you years ago? What do you owe yourself when your own truth contradicts your vows? That evening, my husband suggested we take a walk. The air was cooler than usual, the early signs of winter approaching. We walked in silence for most of it, listening to the crunch of gravel underfoot and the wind moving through the nearly bare branches. Eventually, he said, "You've been quieter lately." I nodded, not denying it. "I've been trying to figure out if you're sad," he added, "or just somewhere else entirely." I turned to him then, and for the first time in weeks, we looked at each other without the need to soften the edges. "I don't know," I said, truthfully. He nodded. Okay. Nothing more. And yet everything was said. The next day, I found myself cleaning out the bottom drawer of my nightstand. Old receipts, dried pens, a notebook with half-filled pages. Tucked between them was a photo from years ago, one my husband had taken during a trip we barely spoke of anymore. In the picture, I was laughing, standing near a fountain, my arms outstretched as water splashed behind me. I didn't recognize that woman either. That night, I placed the photo on my desk and left it there. Not as a reminder of who I'd been, but as a question of who I had become since then, and whether I still wanted to keep becoming her. On Friday morning, I stood in the kitchen holding a fresh mug of tea when my phone buzzed. A single message. Unprompted. Unanticipated. I hope you're okay. It was from him. Simple. Soft. Entirely in character. I stared at it for a long time, unsure of what I felt. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry. Not because I wanted to end anything. But because I needed to sit with the silence again. To figure out whether the sound of my own voice still made sense to me. I wasn't afraid of what I felt. But I was afraid of building something on top of a truth I hadn't yet named aloud. That night, I lay awake while my husband slept beside me, the room quiet except for the soft hum of the heater. My hand rested over my chest, feeling the steady thump of my heart. It beat no faster than usual. No slower. Just steady. Just there. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. You don't always lose yourself in a single decision. Sometimes, you lose yourself over time. And sometimes, if you're very careful, you can start to find your way back. It had been nearly 2 weeks since I received that quiet message, "I hope you're okay." I never replied, and he never followed up. The silence between us was not cold or dismissive. It felt more like a boundary laid gently in place, not to sever, but to protect whatever still pulsed quietly underneath. I didn't know what would become of it. I only knew I wasn't ready to revisit it, not yet. My husband had stopped asking subtle questions. He no longer watched me across the dinner table, trying to decipher my silences. Maybe he had accepted what he had already known for some time, that something had shifted between us, something permanent but not explosive. We moved like travelers who knew they were nearing the end of a journey, unsure if they'd return to the same starting point or take different flights home. One evening, I came home from the grocery store to find him sitting in the living room with a glass of wine, not watching anything in particular on the television. The room was dim, only the floor lamp beside him casting light across his shoulder. He looked up when I entered and said, without any bitterness or performative weight, "I packed up some of the old books in the guest room. Thought it might be time to make space." I nodded. "That's a good idea." It wasn't a metaphor. He didn't mean it to be. But it became one anyway. That weekend, I cleared out the cabinet beneath the stairs. I found an old coat I had forgotten about, still holding the scent of last winter. I found mismatched gloves, unopened candles, expired batteries. It was the kind of forgotten space that quietly collects the remnants of a life too busy to notice. As I pulled out box after box, I began to realize how much of my life had lived untouched, how much I had stored away to deal with later. I took the contents outside, sorted what to toss, what to keep, what to let go of. By evening, I stood in the doorway of the now empty closet, staring at the clean space, unsure whether to fill it again or leave it open. That night at dinner, we sat quietly. Not uncomfortably. Just quietly. Afterward, my husband reached across the table, rested his fingers lightly on mine, and said, "I think we're both trying." I met his eyes and nodded. "We are." And it was true. Trying didn't always mean fixing. It didn't mean repairing the exact version of what had existed before. Sometimes it meant acknowledging what had changed, and choosing to stay in the room anyway. The next morning, I went for a walk without telling him. I didn't leave a note. I didn't text. I just needed air. I walked through our neighborhood, then farther, until I reached a park I hadn't visited in years. It was empty, except for a woman jogging with her dog and an older couple sitting on a bench beneath a row of yellowing trees. I sat on a bench at the far end of the path and watched the wind push through the branches. Leaves tumbled to the ground in gentle spirals. The light filtered through uneven clouds, warm and soft. I closed my eyes and let myself breathe, fully and deeply. When I opened them again, I felt the strangest sense of calm. Not clarity, just calm. A sense that whatever came next, I would meet it as I was, not as I had been before this all began. I walked back slowly. No music, no distractions. Just the sound of my shoes against the sidewalk and the rhythm of my breath. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, but I didn't look right away. I let it stay there, unanswered, until I returned home. Inside, the house smelled like coffee. My husband was in the kitchen, reading the news on his tablet, his reading glasses sliding down his nose. I stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment, then stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. He looked up, smiled faintly, and said, "You okay?" And this time, I answered, "I think so." We didn't hug. We didn't discuss the meaning behind those words. We simply stood there, in the quiet, letting the space between us hold what it could. Later that day, I finally opened the message I had ignored for days. "I hope you're okay." I read it again and again. I hovered my fingers above the keyboard, typed a few words, then deleted them. I didn't know what to say, and I no longer felt pressured to fill the silence. So I did something else. I wrote a letter. Not to send. Just to write. I wrote about the pain in my back and how it had been a doorway into something larger. I wrote about silence, about longing, about the way our bodies carry truths our minds bury. I wrote about that studio, about the light through the window, about the tea, the stillness, the moments we never named. I didn't write about love. That wasn't the word. It had never been about that. It was about recognition. I folded the letter and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk. Maybe one day I'd revisit it. Maybe not. As the sun set that evening, I stood at the window and watched the sky turn orange, then purple, then blue. I thought about everything I had been, everything I had undone, and everything I had yet to become. My husband called from the other room, asking if I wanted to order in. I answered yes. And that night, over takeout containers and flickering candles, we talked. Not about the past. Not about what we did or didn't say. We talked about movies, about recipes we wanted to try, about a friend we hadn't seen in too long. We talked like people who knew each other's history and still chose to stay at the table. I don't know what will be next. I don't know if this new shape will hold, or if we'll eventually grow in directions too different to meet again in the middle. But I know this. I am not the same woman who stepped into that studio weeks ago. And for the first time in a very long time, I am not afraid of what that means.